A dull crack rolled across the river, and the bridge settled by a finger's breadth, enough to send ripples through the foam that gathered at its pylons. At the span's center, a female elephant stood half off the boards, chest wedged to a split beam, her right foreleg fallen through a jagged gap. Rain braided across the planks and darkened the wood. Water found every nail hole and seam. She held her ears wide and still. Breathing in short, contained bursts, her trunk resting against the rail as if the rail were the one steady thing left. They did not rush her. The rangers let their own breathing match the rain and read the structure before they read the animal. The angle of the shattered plank, the lean of the beam, the small shifts transmitted to the rail with each breath she took. One crouched to sight along the grain toward the abutment. Another checked upstream for a tree sound enough to take a line. A third marked the span's narrowest seam with the tip of a glove. Her leg hung to the knee, skin grazed where wood had bitten, lower folds painted with mud the color of riverbank clay. When she shifted a fraction, the bridge answered with a low wooden moan, and she went still again. She did not trumpet, did not thrash. She did the hardest thing a body can do: remain. They had followed her from the valley track after a villager reported a lone elephant crossing at dusk. The bridge was old. A cracked plank had turned up like a blade as her weight came on, catching and then collapsing so that the leg slid through and the chest met the beam. She had made a single, breathy sound and then anchored herself to balance, ribs high, head low, eyes on the far bank's scrub. The team split without speaking. Two stayed at the near end to watch for sag, one crossed to the far side to judge the abutment, and one stood near her shoulder to be a presence more than a touch. He kept his hands open at his sides so she could see them. His voice was only for rhythm. "Easy," he said, and the word fell into the weather. They were not here to bend her fear. They were here to build the ground beneath it. Cutting was not an option. Noise and sparks invite panic. Prying risked dropping the leg deeper or torquing her against the beam. They chose the slower answer. Rebuild the floor beneath her with branches and pads, use a rope placed high around the torso to take just enough weight for her to lift, and keep the pull so quiet it felt like less than a hand on the air. Every step would be decided by her body's replies: the shift of shoulder, the roll of ribs, the tilt of an eye. Rain steadied into a fine sheet. A ranger walked backward along the boards, testing each plank, then climbed down to the bank to gather straight-limbed branches from stormfall. Another uncoiled rope and fed it hand to hand so it would not slap. The team leader tested the hand winch and set it aside. They worked like people who had done this before, but never exactly this. Respectful of. Wood and wait, ready to stop at the first wrong sound. The elephant lowered her head an inch and exhaled, sending a bead of water swinging from her trunk's tip. Her eyes held the middle distance. The river's gray face, the pale stones, the tremble of tamarind leaves. When a branch brushed her ankle, she lifted and set it down again. The rangers slid a folded tarp between chest and beam, fingers moving under wet hide in a slow, deliberate way that acknowledged the tremor there. With each breath, the tarp rose and fell. The river stitched its hush to the rhythm of her lungs. They layered the branches across the gap in a cross-hatched bed, packed smaller sticks between to spread force, then added a canvas square to keep edges from biting. The rope passed around her barrel, high enough to lift without pinching the leg. One ranger stood by the winch with a palm on the handle, not to haul, but to feel. Another stood at her flank watching breath and the small conversations of muscle under skin. The man near her head didn't touch her. He only stood where she could see him if she chose to look. The first pull was the weight of a question. Fibers tightened. The tarp creaked. Her shoulder rose a fraction and rested again. Nothing slid. The second pull held for a slow count and eased. Between pulls they paused so her breathing could smooth itself. Patience is a kind of tool, and they used it as they used rope, measured. On the third pull she gathered herself, not by crouching, there was no room, but by thickening along shoulder and rib. Her trunk touched the woven floor as if testing its promise. Her tail flicked once against her haunch. The bridge spoke again, longer this time, a tired timbre that nevertheless held. They waded through the note, then gave her the smallest lift their hands could manage. She drew her leg higher until the skin skimmed the branches and mud streaked away. One more breath, then another. The far bank ranger rotated his wrist. Abutment stable. The winch moved a finger's width and stopped. She shifted, set the ball of her foot on the cross-hatched bed, and let weight down in a careful test. A soft double thud followed, the sound of a foot accepting what hands had made. The man near her head murmured, "Almost there," and nothing else. They stopped pulling. The rope stayed as safety, but the next direction had to be hers. She took it. One forefoot found a solid plank, then the other joined it. The boards bowed and held. Ribs swelled, then eased. Her trunk rose to the rail and steadied. The Rangers stepped back one pace, then another, leaving space for a body to own its escape. Leaves clung to her shins. She did not bolt. She read the bridge as they had, listening for its center. When she moved, it was by fractions, aligning with the span's strongest seam, giving the old wood the courtesy of her balance. Downriver, the current combed around a midstream boulder and lifted into pale backs where the shallows pinched flow. A fish rose and fell with a sound like a fingertip on a drum. The team waited, hands open, boots quiet on wet boards, until she chose earth over planks and stepped onto gravel and grass. They did not call it finished. Relief fell inward rather than outward. They watched her test the shore with the heel of her foot, watched the tremor fade from her flank as longer breaths returned. The scraped skin no longer bled. Rain washed it clean. She turned parallel to the river and stood, head low, as if taking stock of the water's speed and the bridge's shape. The span behind her was patched for the moment, ringed with prints and the shed leaves of their work. The river moved past without comment. For a time they stayed and matched their breathing to hers, carrying forward the quiet that had made the rescue possible. They stayed with her through the wet dark, never rushing, never forcing her forward. The rain softened to a mist, but the planks beneath her still carried water, each droplet running in slow threads toward the river's edge. The female stood pinned, her foreleg resting against the bed of branches they had layered beneath her, ribs heaving with the strain of holding still. Every breath seemed to balance wood and water. The Rangers knew they could not simply wait. The bridge sagged, her muscles quivered with the effort. They had to give her ground again. One Ranger moved to the edge where a tree bent low, roots braced against stone. Its trunk had grown in a curve that leaned toward the bridge, wide enough to hold the weight of rope. He looped the first coil there, his hands slow, testing bark for soundness. Another Ranger measured the distance with a glance, then stepped forward carrying the rope like a river, feeding it across open air, letting it rest on boards rather than drag. Their motions carried the rhythm of habit, practiced yet cautious, every gesture shaped by the fact that a wild animal was watching them with unblinking eyes. The rope slid across her side, not rough, but deliberate. She shifted once, ears twitching, then stilled. Her trunk lowered to test the canvas beneath her chest, brushing the fabric the way she might brush leaves aside to find water. The Ranger near her shoulder kept his palm turned outward where she could see. He spoke in a tone barely higher than the rain. "It's all right, girl." The words were less message than cadence, a steady sound woven into the pattern of drops on wood. Branches continued to arrive, straight limbs of acacia, storm-felled but still strong. Each was trimmed and set crosswise, laid into the gap until the whole became a floor again. The smell of wet bark rose with each placement. One man knelt, wedging smaller sticks into corners to close spaces, while another pressed a folded tarp across the top so that the planks would not bite her skin if she shifted too quickly. When they leaned back, the gap looked less like a wound in the bridge and more like a rough, living raft. The winch was carried into place, its metal dulled with old rust, its base braced against the curving trunk. A Ranger set his hand to the handle but did not turn it yet. Another stood by the rope at her flank, ready to guide its rise so it would not pinch. They shared only brief nods, each man measuring both the elephant and the wood beneath her. A bird called once from the far bank, then the river drowned it out again. The air was heavy with silence and waiting. The first pull was tentative. The rope tightened, not enough to lift but enough to gather. Her skin shivered where fibers touched. She leaned her weight against the beam, trunk pressing harder to the rail. The rope eased back. They watched. She blinked slowly and let her chest rise again. That was the answer they needed. The second pull held longer. The beam creaked under her but did not shift. Beneath her belly the rope began to bear some of the burden, taking a sliver of her weight. She tested the support with a faint push of her shoulder. Mud streaked her skin as she moved, then she stopped, as if deciding. The winch steadied, paused, then released once more. They were patient. A rescue does not move faster than the animal allows. At the third pull, her leg lifted fraction by fraction, freed from the jagged bite of timber. The branches caught it, bending under her weight but holding. She raised her head for the first time since they arrived, ears angling forward. One ranger whispered, "Yes." "Good." Then silence returned, thick and complete. They worked in inches. The winch moved a handspan, then none at all. Each time they let her choose whether to follow. Sometimes she only breathed, flanks heaving with rain-dark streaks. Sometimes she shifted her weight in small arcs that tested both rope and bridge. Each test told them more than words could. At last, her foot found the makeshift bed of wood and canvas. She pressed down. The branches bent, but stayed, the tarp spreading the strain. Her toes flexed in the mud-streaked wrap, then set flat. The bridge shuddered with the acceptance of weight, then steadied. She withdrew the leg fully from the gap, sides trembling with effort, and for the first time stood square upon the boards again. She did not surge forward. She did not flee. She simply stood, holding balance where none had been. The rope slackened at her side. The rangers stepped back 2 paces, leaving space for her to command the ground again. Her eyes flicked once toward the trees, then back to the river. She swung her trunk across the rail and rested it there, as though considering. The rain slowed further, drops falling with long pauses between. The river ran brown, with silt stirred by storm. Across the far bank, grass leaned in unison as wind passed through. She shifted one foot onto firmer board, then another. The scrape on her chest bled faintly, but the water washed it clean. Her tail flicked once, brushing her haunch. It was no more than a gesture. To balance, but to the rangers it felt like a signal that she was whole again. She crossed to the gravel at the bank's edge, each step tested, each pause answered by the bridge's low groan. When her final foot touched soil, the sound of the wood eased back into the river's voice. She turned her head once, not toward them, but toward the bridge she had left behind, and stood still. Behind her, the patched floor bore only rope marks and scattered leaves. Before her, the bank spread into wet grass, open ground ready for her weight. They did not follow. They remained on the boards, hands resting against damp rails, watching her choose her pace. She stood for a long while, then finally lowered her trunk to the earth, drawing mud across her skin where rain had left it bare. The rangers exchanged a glance but spoke nothing. What mattered had already been said in rope, branch, and silence. Her steps carried her up the incline to firmer ground. The team stayed behind, coiling rope, gathering tools, letting the bridge rest in its weary shape. In the hush, the only movement was her broad back swaying into the trees, scarred but upright, her calf muscles steady beneath hide. The forest swallowed her shape one shadow at a time until only the sound of leaves moving against rain remained. Freed from the broken bridge, she did not follow the gap the rangers had cleared through scrub. Instead, she drifted to the waterline, lowered her trunk among wet stones, and lifted a thin braid of river to touch the skin between her eyes. A deep rumble started in her chest and moved into the ground. Then a visible wave crossed her flank, slow and deliberate, no shiver, no fear, only a rhythm building from within. They understood it without speaking. Rope lay coiled, the winch stilled, the canvas folded and set beyond her reach. No one urged her forward. This was not shock. It was an older task beginning. They stepped back and edited hazards the way quiet hands tidy a room. A nail lifted from gravel, a splintered plank dragged higher on the bank, a shallow divot filled so a heel would not sink if she shifted. Rain thinned to a fine sift that polished stone without soaking it. She widened her hind stance and angled toward the current, lengthening each breath until it matched the river's run. Clear fluid traced beneath her tail and darkened the mud. She drew her trunk along the curve of her belly and paused near the ribs, as if measuring pressure. Muscle bands tightened and eased under gray hide with patient regularity. They arranged themselves as attendants, not actors. One ranger climbed the slope to keep curious footsteps from the track. Another walked the upstream bend, checking for dogs. The leader stayed at the gravel's edge, eyes on her feet and the ground they would need to hold. When he spoke, it was barely sound. "We'll give you space." The words disappeared into rain and did not disturb her. Her ears rested half open to move heat. She pivoted until the river faced her and the bridge stood to her left like a question already answered. The next contraction drew the loin tight and changed the belly's round to an oval. She expelled air through her trunk in a steady stream, not a blast. When it passed, she stepped back the length of her foot and steadied, toes gripping the flattest stones. Time widened. She grew quiet for spans measured by rain. then rocked forward and back as force returned, setting weight with care. With each surge, a low tone moved through her body into gravel and wood. The bridge, relieved of her weight, carried that sound like a wire. The men felt it more than heard it and answered by standing still, becoming lighter in the place without stepping away. They made the bank safe and left it alone. A twisted branch was tossed higher on the slope. A shallow hole was filled with handfuls of gravel. The kit remained closed but near, gauze and saline for a need that likely would not come. Most berths asked for witness, not help. Their task was absence shaped with attention. Be here. Change nothing. Keep harm far. Her trunk returned to the belly's underside, lingering where each wave began. Clear fluid gave way to a thin, milky thread. She rocked in labor's rhythm. Weight forward, pause, weight back, breathe, and held to it like a path. Without meaning to, the men matched it in their chests, timing breath to hers, moving only when a small threat appeared. A rolling stone nudged still, a loose strap carried away. The next contraction lasted longer. Lines stood along her flanks as if bone had stepped nearer the surface. She bent her knees slightly, took the strain without fighting it, and let it pass. When it eased, she drank, not greedily, just enough to wet mouth and throat. The swelling told its own story, the intervals shortened, the tail lifted and did not quite fall. The men noted and did not speak. Mucus pooled and fell. The next wave drew the abdomen inward so cleanly that the roundness flattened, then quivered. She sidestepped once to match foot to rock. Effort rose into her chest and held, then left in a narrow stream that stirred dust at the stone's edge. Rain stopped entirely. Cloud leaned over the river and turned it the color of iron. They could count minutes to full dark and meters to the truck, but numbers were not the measure now. A wild animal they had freed decided not to leave. She would bring the next thing to the place she had chosen. Water close, stones level, sound large enough to fold a smaller sound inside. The dry track promised safety later. The riverbank promised safety now. "It's okay," the closest ranger said, a thin reed of sound set on a broad current. She did not react. She did not need to. She stood in the posture old mothers have used in this valley, and the men adjusted their bodies to fit that history. Hands low, shoulders soft, eyes on her feet, and the ground that would need to keep faith when force crested. Another wave came, braided of two. The first climbed and held. The second arrived before the first had gone. Her abdomen drew inward until muscle ridges stacked like cords. She pressed her trunk to the stone as if listening through it, then swayed once when the tightness released. Between surges, she grew more quiet, not less. The world narrowed to breath, pressure, and the placement of feet. The ridge blurred and sharpened as light shifted. Clouds opened a pale window on the river and slid it away. She stepped backward one pace and forward again into the same print, deepening it. A strand of milky fluid hung and broke. The rangers read the sum of signs and accepted what they had suspected since the first ripple crossed her flank. The bridge had not held her by fear alone. They prepared for what the next hour might ask and for what it would not. The kit stayed ready. The path remained clear. Voices fell to brief practical phrases about footing and sightlines. Each chose a place and kept it. The river spoke for them. Wind pressed grass flat and let it rise again, and with every cycle the pattern inside her grew firmer, each wave standing taller than the last. Another contraction climbed, and for the first time, her tail lifted higher and held. The volval rim bulged and softened. Heat brightened her skin without panic. She braced, breathed, and let it travel. The men did nothing but witness and ensure the world did not interfere. Stones did not shift. Water did not leap. The tired bridge carried her low tone and returned it like a steady wire. By the time cloud thinned to a lighter gray, pattern had become certainty. She refused the dry track not in confusion but with purpose. She kept the river's voice, the level stones, the scent of wet wood, the safety of open sight lines. The men, who had come to move her, became part of the stillness that allowed the work to continue. The valley drew close around them and widened again with her breath. What had kept her on the span had never been fear alone. Labor had already turned her toward the river even as wood failed beneath her. Freed from the boards, she refused the path because she knew the ground she wanted. That knowing held her steady. She stood where water spoke and stones did not lie, waiting for the next thing to begin, while the men settled into the quiet that would carry it. The river held its steady voice while she turned herself slowly, planting each foot in a careful square. The pressure inside her body had climbed beyond rhythm into inevitability, and at last she bent her knees and folded onto the gravel. The stones shifted beneath her, clicking together as weight pressed them flat, but the bank held. Rain had passed, leaving the air cool, washed of dust. The rangers, reading the change in her posture, stepped outward, giving her a broad, open ring of space. No one spoke. Their silence formed a circle as much as their feet did. Her sides expanded, ribs widening as she drew in breath, then pulled tight as another contraction arrived. The trunk traced the ground once, sweeping a slow arc that collected grit, then rose and pressed against her flank. Her eyes stayed half-lidded, focused inward, body answering the command of muscle and time. A long, low moan traveled through her chest and into the stones, muffled by earth but strong enough that the men felt it in their boots. Fluid pooled beneath her tail, clear at first, then clouded with a pink tinge. She shifted, leaning on one elbowed foreleg, hips rising as she bore down. The world seemed to hush in response. Birds along the ridge fell silent. The river slowed in perception, though it never changed its pace. Only her breathing counted time. She exhaled with effort, then paused to inhale a volume of air that filled her chest until her hide stretched taut. Another ripple crossed her belly, drawing it into sharp ridges, and with a sudden push, the amniotic sac slipped free, shining against the wet gravel. The calf's front feet came first, small compared to her massive frame, yet heavy with promise. They glistened, curled inward, then were followed by a narrow trunk pressed close to the body. She rocked once, repositioning, then strained again. A soft grunt joined the sound of water. The calf slid out in a fluid spill, collapsing into the stones with a muted thud. The sack burst on contact, sending mist and river scent into the air. For a moment, the new shape lay motionless, slick, its skin folded and wet. Then a shiver passed across its flank. The mother remained down but turned her trunk immediately, sweeping it over the calf's body. She cleared mucus from the tiny nostrils with practiced strokes, drawing away clumps and flinging them aside. The calf sneezed once, a frail whistle, then drew its first full breath. Air filled new lungs and left again in a startled cry that carried into the valley. Across the far bank, an echo stirred, distant elephants answering in low, rolling notes that merged with the river's sound. The rangers glanced at one another, relief in their stillness. They had seen calves born in forests, in dust fields, even in captivity, but never here, never on the damp stones of a river that still tugged at the broken bridge. They stood back, resisting the instinct to move closer. Their work now was only to keep the circle clear, to let her bond form without interference. She rose slowly, first pushing to her knees, then rocking forward to stand, flanks heaving from strain. Mud streaked her sides. She swung her trunk again, dusting the calf with quick, firm strokes, stimulating muscles to wake. The calf attempted to lift its head, wobbling on a neck too weak for weight, then let it fall. She nudged again, more insistent. The calf cried, short and high, and folded one leg under its belly. Minutes passed in this rhythm. Try, fall, nudge, cry. Each time the calf gained a fraction more strength. The mother straddled her stance to give space, eyes fixed. Downward, trunk moving constantly, clearing nostrils, brushing stones aside, pressing against shoulders. She reached once beneath its belly and lifted, only enough to encourage, never enough to force. The calf staggered onto two knees, then collapsed, sending a puff of river dust upward. One ranger whispered without intending to, "Come on, little one." The sound was softer than rain, but the others heard and did not correct it. They, too, wanted the calf upright. Still they held back, knowing no hand could aid here without harm. The calf tried again, front legs unfolding in uncertain jerks. Its rear limbs shook as they pushed against the stones. The body rose halfway, paused, then crumpled sideways, rolling onto wet gravel. A pause followed, silence heavy. The mother lowered her head, touching trunk tip to belly, then to chest, then sliding it along the calf's back with a pressure that said, "Continue." The calf heaved itself upright again. This time, the effort held longer. Knees locked, hindquarters rose, and the small form stood fully for the first time, legs trembling but firming with each heartbeat. The rangers exhaled together. One pressed a hand to his thigh as if grounding himself. They had seen rescues succeed, but this was different. This was life arriving into the same hour as danger had nearly claimed the mother. The calf swayed and nearly toppled but caught itself, head bobbing under the weight of a trunk it had not yet mastered. The mother curved around it, forming a barrier against the river. She leaned into the calf, not enough to knock it over but enough to let its body feel hers, teaching balance by proximity. The calf responded, pressing its wet flank against her massive leg. Another cry burst forth, louder this time. Across the valley the herd's chorus answered again, rolling over water and ridge in a wave of sound both ancient and familiar. The newborn staggered forward 2 steps, hind legs unsure, forelegs stiff. It collapsed once more, but the fall was less heavy. Within moments it was rising again. Determination lay not in thought but in reflex, the body's insistence to live. The mother remained vigilant, every shift of her weight aligned to protect, every motion of her trunk urging. As the calf finally steadied, rain began again in the lightest drops, falling onto stone, hide, rope, and wood alike. The bridge behind them dripped with water through broken seams, but on the riverbed a small new life leaned into its mother's side, ribs lifting in unison with hers. She rumbled deep and low, the sound a promise that carried across both air and earth. The rangers did not step closer. They knew their role was nearly over. They had freed her from wood and fear, but this was hers alone. The circle they had drawn remained open, respectful, protective only in presence. They would hold it until she chose to leave. The calf shook its head, ears like soft leaves plastered with rain. The mother reached and brushed water away, then nudged it forward again. Its steps gained confidence, each one steadier than the last. Together they stood in the river's mist, framed by broken timber and smooth stones, their breaths rising as one. Across the far bank, the herd's answering chorus rolled again, deep and continuous, until it blended into the river's eternal sound. By morning, the light thinned the mist and warmed the stones, and the calf moved with a new steadiness beside its mother, feet printing shallow moons in the ribbon of silt where the river had pulled back. The mother's breath came deep and even, a low thread that answered only when the small body leaned too far or stopped to test a pebble. The rangers watched from the edge of their circle, boots dark with wet, letting the bank belong to her while they kept danger from drifting near. Downstream, the broken bridge hung in tired angles. 2 men waded to the outer supports and eased the largest boards onto the bank, dragging them above the waterline where they would no longer threaten a misstep. Another cut the frayed ends of the rope and coiled what could be saved, leaving the anchoring tree bare, its bark indented with the memory of strain. The calf learned in short runs of courage. It stepped, paused, stepped again, knees uncertain, trunk swinging in small arcs that sketched the air without finding much. Each wobble met the mother's patient correction. A hip angled to block the water's pull, a forefoot planted so the little one could lean, a low vibration that settled the quiver in those new legs. It tried a sidelong turn and nearly toppled, then corrected, pressing a wet flank to her until steadiness returned. They had seen first mornings before, but this one held the hush of a place that had been dangerous and was not anymore. The men worked without hurry. What could be removed was removed. When the sun pushed a pale hand through cloud, heat rose from the stones and turned their damp faces to dull silver. The newborn nosed her belly until a teat was found. The river's voice covered the small, steady suckling, and an hour passed with little to mark it but the calf's stronger stance. On the far bank her distant kin answered once, a low chorus that faded into leaves. They began the crossing when the morning had just enough warmth to loosen muscle but not fatigue it. The calf drifted along the mother's leg until it faced the narrow ribbon of sand that led toward scrub. The mother angled behind, body a moving wall. The first steps on the path were clumsy, then a hoof found firmer soil. The calf took 3 confident paces, stumbled, and was caught by a gentle nudge that looked casual but had the exact weight needed. "That's it," a ranger whispered, the words thinner than wind and gone at once. They reached the margin where stones gave way to crushed grass. The men stood back at the limits of their own prints, unwilling to add a mark to that tender edge. The calf paused, nostrils tasting sap and dust baked into leaves. The mother breathed across its back and stepped forward, inviting motion without pushing it. Their shadows fell together on the sand, one broad and steady, one thin and wavering, moving as a single shape toward shade. Before they left the river's hearing, the mother turned. It was not a human glance, not a farewell, only a measured look to check the ground and the distance to the old noise. Her ear tipped, and breath left her trunk in a slow thread that wavered in the warming air. The youngest ranger lowered his eyes first. The leader stood with a palm on the rail that had held through storm and said only, "Easy road now." When mother and calf reached the scrub, the calf hesitated again, listening to a rustle and a pocket of cool. Then they went on, bodies sliding into bushes and dust-dark stems, steps muffled by shade. For a few seconds the calf's back flashed between branches, then even that gleam closed under green. Work remained. The men lifted the last splintered beam, set it on the bank, and marked the span with bright cloth so foot traffic would avoid it until crews could come. They took a final look at the riverbed. Damp stones shone where the calf had lain. Silt dried in crescents over the prints, cupping the shape of first steps like held water. Proof of effort lay everywhere and hurt nothing. They did not linger. The kit closed with a clipped latch. A shovel was stowed. The coil of salvage rope thumped once against a tailgate. As the truck eased back along the track, the broken bridge fell behind a fringe of low branches and was gone. Wind moved across the open patch and laid grass in one direction, then another, erasing what it could. The river kept its voice, and with every meter the sound thinned until only the idea of it remained. On the ridge where the road climbed, one ranger looked back. Scrub folded over the path to the bank. The morning had grown bright and ordinary, yet the feel of her breath, that faint, steady thread in the warm air, stayed with them all. It would return later, in the tap of rope against a hook, at the sink where mud washed from hands, in the pause before sleep when the day weighs itself and is put away. Two shadows had left the river, and the valley kept their passing like a quiet held in the grass,